Okay, welcome everybody to today's discussion of memoQ terminology extraction and some of the options that we have for getting more out of that particular feature. And I'd like to point out at the beginning that the memoQ versions that I'm going to be presenting or discussing are version 8.4 or later. And the reason for this is that in the recent versions of memoQ, there have been quite a few expansions of the terminology functionalities, both for term extraction and for managing the entries in the term bases or the term bases themselves. And if you're working with an earlier version of memoQ, you can still do a lot of the things that I'm going to show you, but in some cases it might take a lot more effort, or in some cases it's simply not possible. But anyway, I highly recommend that for doing your terminology work, that you work with version 8.4 of memoQ or later and consider an upgrade, even if most of your work with memoQ takes place with an earlier version, because that's what your client server uses or something like that. You can do a lot of your terminology work in a more recent version and have those term bases available for use in older versions of memoQ. It's possible, as most of you probably know, to have any number of memoQ versions installed in parallel on your computer. You just have to put them into different folders to keep the resources separate. But at any given time, I might have 3 or 4 or 5 different versions of memoQ installed on a particular computer. Something that I'd also like to point everybody to at the beginning are some resources where you can get additional information on this topic. First off, there's my YouTube channel where I've got a number of presentations that have to do with terminology, including a recent one that was done last spring called Getting on Better Terms with memoQ. That's a longer talk where I discuss optimizing the properties of term entries and things like that for better QA. A lot of this was covered in the German talk recently, but because these resources are already available in English, I'm omitting that today to save time and give more opportunities for discussion. But all of this is available on memoQ. You can get to my channel using a shortcut, a bit.ly shortcut that I show here, bit.ly/KSL videos, all written together. And also my blog, Translation Tribulations, has quite a few discussions of different aspects of terminology in memoQ, including some detailed discussions of the somewhat unusual system that memoQ uses for managing its stopword lists. And lastly, I wanted to point everybody to a resource that I've made available for downloading if you work with languages that are not part of the standard set that Kilgray has set up for doing terminology work. That is shown in blue on the slide here. It's on the domain losner.net/downloads/stop-words.zip. And that is a collection of stopword lists that I found in various sources on the internet, just text files for all sorts of languages. You can see some of them listed here on the slide: Arabic, Chinese, Catalan, Danish, or Dutch. And these lists can be used to supplement existing lists that Kilgray or memoQ Technologies may have provided, or they can be used to create completely new stopword lists, as we'll see in the course of this talk today. Okay, well, first off, let's start with a discussion of why would you want to extract terminology. There can be a lot of different reasons for this. The obvious one, or one obvious one, is that you can discover the frequently used expressions in a document, in a translation memory, in a collection of documents, a corpus, much more quickly this way than you can just by flipping through the document and hoping to notice things that are frequent or important, particularly when you're working with very large documents, hundreds of pages or more. Being able to use statistical tools to identify the terms which occur most frequently can be a big time saver. For me, even in shorter documents of maybe a couple thousand words, the term extraction module in memoQ gives me a very quick overview of what's there, so I can just see, okay, am I comfortable with the terminology that's here, or do I need to do some work? It's better for me to find that out before I start translating rather than right in the middle and interrupt my workflow by running off to do a lot of term research. I prefer to do that in advance. And particularly if I'm working in a larger project, coordinating with one or more other colleagues, or I need to spend some time talking with the client about their standard terminology and what they might already be doing with that or what they would like to do with that. So being able to do a preliminary survey of the available terminology using memoQ helps me to get those discussions going, to make the resources available to all project participants or to the client before I get started. And this allows me to work more professionally during the project itself. Another thing that I often use the term extraction module in memoQ for is if I have a client who provides a translation memory, for example, and says, you must stick to the terminology in the TM. Well, sometimes I like to see what this terminology is before I start translating. I want to see what the quality of it is. And very often what I discover when I look into these resources is that there is a lot of variation, particularly if this is what I call a whorehouse TM that has been contributed to by quite a number of other translators. You know, if they're dealing with a translation agency, that might be, God knows how many, 20, 30, 50 different translators, many of whom don't necessarily stick to what is perceived to be the standard terminology. And so you get these TMs that have all kinds of variation in them. And being able to demonstrate this easily with the memoQ term extraction module can avoid uncomfortable discussions about whether you have stuck to the terminology and maybe lead into more productive discussions, like the need to create a formal, standardized, and approved terminology for that particular client. And for me, over the years, this has led to quite a lot of extra paid work and a lot less project aggravation. It's a way of tackling a very frequent problem that I'm sure all of us have encountered at some point in our careers, tackling this problem in a more professional and more productive way. Okay, and for me, terminology extraction using software tools like this is a supplemental method. We all have other ways that we gather terminology. I do a lot of it if I'm doing alignments. I recognize a lot of interesting terms while I go through and check the alignment, and I add them during that alignment. In the recent versions of memoQ, it might be necessary to customize one of the toolbars to include the add term command because it disappeared from the menus some time ago. Also, we always add terminology during translation, QA, and other times. Here I have just a quick snapshot that I took with my cell phone where I show the table of contents of a hard copy translation of German commercial code. Even just reading tables of contents of certain references can give me a lot of good terminology, which I'll just enter directly in a term base, regardless of what its frequency might be. But still, when you're dealing with large documents and often very short time frames, being able to determine which terms occur most frequently can save you an awful lot of work. There will always be terms that occur once, maybe twice, that would fall under the statistical threshold that you set for mining your terms. And these, of course, can be gathered during the course of the translation work. But it's always useful to identify the more frequent things later and save yourself a lot of time. Okay, what sources can be used for mining the terminology? I use other tools sometimes for looking at terminology. One of my favorites is a program called AntConc, created by Professor Lawrence Anthony, who teaches at a Japanese university. He's an Englishman. And he created a very nice tool that allows you to study collections of documents and identify the most frequent terms. It also has an excellent concordance, which I like because it can show me collocations, which words occur together and at what distance from each other. It's very, very nice for that. It's a good teaching tool to use at the university. But one of the restrictions that AntConc has is that it can only work with a very few formats. You can work with text documents, so typically you're converting documents into text format. It can also work, I think, with HTML, maybe one or two other formats. The advantage to using an integrated terminology extraction module like the one in memoQ is that it enables me to do my term searches in every data format that is compatible with that environment. In this case, every translatable document, every one of the many dozens of translatable formats in memoQ can be used for searching for frequent terminology. And you can do a search on all of the documents in a project or just selected documents. It should be pointed out that the memoQ term extraction module is integrated with memoQ. It is not a separate program. And to do any term extraction work, you have to set up a project. That is in contrast, for example, to SDL multi-term extract, which really has nothing to do with multi-term per se. It's a separate program. It runs separately from SDL Trados or from SDL multi-term. And it's a completely different workflow. But it also allows you to work with quite a good variety of formats. I don't know anymore. I've used the program a lot in the past. I don't remember whether it will handle every format that you can now translate with SDL Trados or not. But certainly the memoQ translation, or the memoQ terminology extraction module lets you work with every format in memoQ. It's also, and this is important to point out, it's also included in the cost of acquiring memoQ. So most of you, if you're getting your initial license from memoQ from one of those group buys on Pros, you probably pay somewhere around 400 euros. That's for all of the translation functions, everything that memoQ does, and also for the term extraction module. If I remember correctly, when I got my license to SDL multi-term extract, I paid 500 or 600 euros just for that function. And then SDL Trados, of course, costs some hundreds of euros more, maybe around 600 euros these days, I don't know. So even if you prefer to use other tools like SDL Trados, like WordFast, whatever else you might use occasionally for doing your translation work in addition to memoQ, you can use the memoQ term extraction module as a very cost-effective tool for mining the terminology that you might in fact choose to use in other environments. And you can export the terminology that you've gathered to all of those other environments without a lot of difficulty. As I mentioned before, you can also look at all or selected TMs that are attached to your extraction project. And you can look at any collections of text that you might have in a LiveDocs corpus. Again, specific documents or entire corpora if you want to do it that way. Okay, and here is an example here from the dialogue that you have to complete before starting the term extraction session. And the red box here shows the different sources that can be selected. In this particular example, I'm looking at particular documents for translation that I've selected by holding down the control key and clicking on those in the translation documents list. And I've also chosen to include all of the LiveDocs corpora that are attached to the project in my term extraction. And you might ask, well, okay, what size documents should you have to do a term extraction? As I mentioned before, to get just a quick overview of frequent terminology in a document that I might have to translate, I'll do an extraction section on a document with 2,000 or 3,000 words just to see the most common stuff. Or I can also lower the frequency of the words that I look at to give me a more comprehensive overview of what the terminology in the document may look like. But if I'm trying to build a project glossary, I usually do it, well, I certainly do it for anything that has about 10,000 words or more. There, you usually find a couple of hundred interesting terms that might be worth coordinating with other project participants. In some cases, it may be worthwhile doing so for documents that have 4,000 or 5,000. That's an individual judgment. It only takes a few seconds to start a session and have a quick look and decide whether you want to do a full-on term extraction, build a glossary, or if you just want to get a quick look and an overview of what your documents have in store for you. Okay, and as I mentioned several times, what you're looking at is the statistical frequency of the terms that occur. And it's best to look at this frequency as a filtered frequency. And by that, what I mean is we don't need to see certain words like prepositions, common vocabulary. I don't need to see words like house, dog, cat, plant. Okay, these are just common vocabulary that you would expect anybody who is translating to master, and where no particular coordination is probably needed in a translation team. And in order to do that, there's something called a stopword list. And what that does is it stops collecting those particular words that are on the list. Every statistical term extraction tool that I know, AntConc, SDL multi-term extract, the memoQ tool, and dozens of others that I've probably seen over the years, all of them use stopword lists in one way or another to filter out the uninteresting words. And memoQ comes with a couple of standard lists to help you get started. These are shown here in the screenshot of the memoQ resource console. They have lists that have been provided at various points for German, English, Spanish, French, Hungarian, Italian, Polish, Portuguese now, and Russian. Well, that's not very many languages compared to the number of languages that people work with in memoQ. And that's not really a problem. In fact, these lists here are of varying quality. The German list is quite extensive because the employee of the company that originally produced these lists was German, and she cared a lot about German. And so she put together, I think, a couple thousand words to knock out common German vocabulary. The English list, I think when I looked at it, it had maybe, I don't remember, 120 or maybe 200 or so words. And the others don't have a whole lot of entries, but they get rid of the common stuff like the prepositions and so forth. And they also have some special settings configured, which we'll see in a few minutes. But there are a lot of words out there on the internet. If you go search for most common words in, pick your language, Armenian, you'll get lists out there on the internet that show you common vocabulary in Armenian that you probably would want to exclude when you were doing a term study on Armenian documents. And that zip file that I gave you the URL for at the beginning of this talk has a lot of these lists, which you can incorporate in your work with memoQ if you want to. And here's a quick look at what a memoQ stopword list looks like. On the left of the slide, I've got to look inside of the text file, which was exported from the memoQ resource console. And it looks kind of intimidating. There's some XML up at the top of the document. And then there are the words themselves. And on the right-hand side of the column of words, there's a bunch of mysterious numbers. memoQ stopword lists look a little bit different than stopword lists that you'll see in other programs. And some people find this confusing. I read complaints from time to time that somebody can't use a list that they have from a public source. Well, actually they can. And if you look on my blog, I've got a lot of detailed instructions for how to do that. A long time ago, it used to be a really time-consuming, somewhat confusing process where you would take the lists that you had from the internet, combine them in Excel, eliminate the duplicates, and paste on this XML garbage. You don't have to do any of that anymore. It's now, as of version 8.4 of memoQ, the process is much simpler. You can take any list or any group of lists that you find out there on the internet, put these in a project, as we'll see shortly with Danish, and create a stopword list from this without a lot of trouble. So whatever the languages are that you work with, whatever source languages you work with, you can very quickly, with or without lists that you might find, build your own stopword lists. And by maintaining these, each time you do term extraction work, you can improve the quality of the extractions each time. People ask me sometimes, how long does it take you to do a study of the terminology in these documents? How much time should we budget? Or how much time will it take me? Well, that's going to depend on how much you do the work. If you keep adding to the stopword list each time you do work on terminology, the process becomes more efficient each time. It definitely pays to keep adding words that you really don't need to see again, because of the next time you do term extraction, they're not going to show up. What you see on the right-hand side of this screen shows the same list of words, and then there's 3 columns. One of them says blocks is first, blocks inside, and blocks is last. These columns correspond to those mysterious numbers that you see over on the left, the 1, 1, 1, 1, 0, 1, and so forth. And there are more detailed explanations of this in some articles on my blog. But basically what this is an indication of whether this word, which by itself is going to be blocked. You'll never see, for example, the word before or but or by or can in a term extraction where you use this particular stopword list that's being shown. But if you're looking for phrases in your term extraction, depending on the settings of those little check marks there, you might be able to see by, for example, by, in the middle of a phrase. Candies by John, or something like that. Because maybe this is a phrase, a trademarked phrase that shows up frequently in a marketing document. And in that particular case, you would have the blocks inside unchecked, which in fact is what we see here in the screenshot. The word by blocks is the first word, it blocks is the last word. In other words, it won't show up as the first or the last word in a phrase that memoQ is extracting, but it could show up in the middle of a phrase. Now, when you're adding a list of words that you might have from the stopword lists that I provided or from other sources, the default setting will be that these words will not show up anywhere. So if you're an expert, for example, in Bulgarian, and you use a Bulgarian stopword list to start your own list, you might want to go through and mark the terms somebody's got their microphone active. Please check your settings and mute your microphone if possible. I thought I had this set to block automatically. Anyway, you can go through and manually edit your stopword list, and then allow particular words to show up in phrases that might be of interest. But that's a bit of manual. If you don't do that, well, then the stopword list with its automatic settings will work the same as stopword lists do in every other terminology extraction program I've seen, most of which are not set up to extract phrases. So memoQ offers more functionality, more power than a lot of these other commonly available term extraction tools do. Okay, so how can we get started? I've got a slide here that talks about cloning or making copies of stopword lists. Why would you want to do this? Well, one of the things that I find very useful to do is to create custom stopword lists for specific clients or for specific subject domains. In other words, Kilgray supplies, for example, an English list that has maybe 200 words or so in this. But if I'm doing a lot of work in some particular area of marketing, there might be a lot of vocabulary that occurs frequently in that area that I don't need to see again. And so I will create a specific marketing stopword list or a specific marketing stopword list for a particular customer, where I might be blocking words that would otherwise be of interest in different contexts, but that I do not need to see for that particular client or for that particular subject area. And the way I can do this is from the memoQ Resource Console, for example. I can click the clone command, which is indicated by the large red arrow, and this will make a copy of the existing list that I've selected. I can give it a new name and so forth. And then all the additional vocabulary that I add to that is not going into the original list, so I avoid trashing them, for example. Or during the term extraction session, I can select a list. Here I've selected the Kilgray German list that they supplied back in memoQ 5 days. By clicking Save As, I can create a new stopword list. And that will be available then every time I do a German extraction. It will be in the list of German stopword lists that I can select from. And these stopword lists are not dialect specific. So for example, if you're doing an extraction and excluding things specifically for Australian English, it would probably help to mention Australian somewhere in the title of the stopword list, or Swiss German somewhere in the title of the stopword list, because all of the stopword lists created in projects with source languages of any particular variant will be available every time you do a project for that major language. So English for New Zealand, it will be available when you're doing a project with English UK and so forth. So if it's important for some reason to differentiate, you should do so in the title of your in the name of your stopword list. Okay, and now we're going to have a look in a live demo at how to create a totally new stopword list, starting with nothing, or starting with a list that I found on the internet. In this particular case, I have some special settings that I use to make this process work. I set all the frequencies on 1, as you can see in the red boxes that I've indicated here, because I might be using a list, just maybe one list, where these words only show up one time, and there are no other words of interest. So I can just set it on there, and then I can add those very quickly. Okay, so let's get out of the slides and go have a look at memoQ and create a stopword list for Danish using some existing resources. Okay, I'm going to get out of this. Here we have a project set up with Danish as the source language. And I've got two documents here. I've got a copy of the EU low voltage directive, which is not interesting right now. And I have a stopword list with some common words in Danish. So just take a quick look at that. Okay. And here you see various words in Danish. I don't speak Danish, so I can only guess at what many of them mean. But these are words which you would not want to see if we're doing a Danish term extraction. So in order to put these into a stopword list, now what I've done is I've taken the text file that I found on the internet and I've imported this to my project as if it were a translation document. But I'm not going to be translating it, I'm going to be adding it to the stopword list. So I select that stopword list taken from the outside, and then I go up to the preparation tab in my project. And on the preparation tab, there is this icon with a funny looking document, and in English, the label extract terms. And let's go ahead and click on that and see what happens. Okay, this is the dialog for a term extraction session. And the name of this extraction session is by default the date. I can name it anything I want. I can call it Danish stopwords, for example. Okay, and we'll go through and change the frequencies as I showed in the slide, because this list that I'm looking at only has one entry in each case. And here, let's look at our sources. Okay, we're going to have to make a change there as well. We don't want to look at every document because then in addition to the stopword list, that would be extracting the low voltage directive, which has, I don't know, some 10,000 words or so. So we want to look at selected documents. And as you see behind this dialog, the stopword list in Danish is highlighted. So that is the selected document, and our extraction will be done only with that document. Okay, and look, oh, I have one Danish stopword list from when I showed this before in the German lecture, but we're not going to use that for right now. We're just going to continue with no stopword list. Okay, and here is our stopword lists. Let's have a look at some of the things in the title list. Under length, this shows the number of characters in the length. The pound symbol is the number of times the candidate occurs in the source context. So somehow a couple of these words do occur twice. You can click on these different things in the title to change the sort order. For example, by clicking on the source header, I can get an alphabetized list, ascending or descending. Okay. And in this particular case, in this particular case, what I want to do is I want to add the entire list to my stopwords. So I'm simply going to click on the first entry, and then I'm going to go all the way to the bottom of my list, hold down my Shift key, and click here. So I've selected all of the entries, and then up in the ribbon for term extraction, there is a command to add as stopword. So we'll go ahead and click on that. And it tells me, oh, we don't have a stopword list here. Do I want to create a new one? Yes, I do want to create a new stopword list. So we'll click Create New. And I'm going to give it a lit. I can give it a name. I can write a description if that's helpful to do so. And now it's going to show me a list of all of those words that I just selected for addition to the stopword list. And if everything looks okay, then I click Save List. If I don't do that, it's not going to save these new entries in the list. Okay, and then I close. And now, for example, when I restart my session, if I want to do that, sometimes if I mess things up, I want to start over again. I will now see my Danish basic stopwords in that list, and I can go through and change the properties for whether or not it blocks on the side or not. For example, I can, there. And now that change will be saved in the stopword list, if that's a meaningful change that I would like to make to it. Okay, so now I've taken a list that I found off the internet, and in just a few minutes, I've created a Danish stopword list. I can share that list with other people. For example, I go up to the memoQ resource console, here to the stopword lists. I can filter, select that list, click export, and this will create a resource that I can then share with colleagues by email, or I can put it on a server or whatever. And they can then load this Danish stopword list into their system and work with it. So this is also something that you might be able to do for clients of yours who want to do term extraction work, but maybe don't have the expertise to create the list for their staff to work with. That's a nice thing about memoQ. Most of the resources that you create for your work can be shared with colleagues, and stopword lists are among those. Okay, now let's look at a little more practical example of using stopwords. Let's have a look at some work that I was doing with a EUR-LEX document. This is from the EU's archive of legislation and other interesting documents. If you do work with EU documents or work that references these EU documents, these are very interesting sources of terminology. Here I've got one of the explosives directives, 142,000 characters, probably about 30,000 words, more or less. Okay, and let's look and see what other resources we've got. Okay, I've got a LiveDocs corpus with a couple of directives with English and German translations in parallel. And then I've got a number of term bases in this project as well. 1, 2, 3, 5 of them selected for various sorts. Most of them are demonstration term bases. And a couple of translation memories. Okay, that's pretty good. So here, for example, in the LiveDocs view, if I want to do a term extraction, I can select the LiveDocs corpus that I want to work with. I can select particular documents within that corpus and then bring up the preparation ribbon. I can do this from a number of contexts. I can also do this from the translation memories list or from the translation documents list if I want to do that. Okay, but here I'm going to select the preparation ribbon and tell it to extract terms. Now here, we see a little something different than we did with the Danish project. In the Danish project, I did not have any active term extraction sessions. Each time you start a term extraction, it creates a so-called session. Now, why would you want to have more than one session? Here you can see I've already got 2. We're about to start a 3rd. What would be the point of that? Well, when I'm doing term work and looking at the terminology in the document, I often find it useful to take several different looks from different perspectives. Anyway, why is it useful to have multiple term extraction sessions. In the first session, I might be looking at the translation document that I'm going to be working on, and I want to look at the terminology in that. Then I might have a collection of reference documents that the client has provided to me, where I want to look at the frequent vocabulary in that and maybe see how much it overlaps with the terminology in the document I'll be translating. So I would have a separate session where I would be looking at those reference documents. And I might have yet another session where I'm looking at terminology that occurs in the TM. Or maybe one of those sessions, I'm looking at individual words. And in another one, I'm a little bit more expansive. And so I'm allowing it to look at frequent phrases. I find that by looking at terminology from different perspectives, I'm often able to discover the terminology in a particular document or collection of documents more efficiently. You're not limited to just one particular approach. So here I'm going to start a new session, and I'm going to rename it. Oops. Okay, I'm going to go with all of the defaults here. Okay, and it usually doesn't take very long to get started. This particular thing, oh, I didn't, hang on, I'm going to cancel this. I forgot to pay attention to what I was doing the extraction with. Okay, I'm going to start a new one. I want to look only at the selected LiveDocs document. So I'm going to be doing the extraction only on the EU low voltage directive, just as an example. And this is about 10,000 words. Okay. As you can see here, it's got some phrases. In fact, it's got a lot of junk. Here I see the word "and." Oh, I bet I know why that is. It's because I forgot to apply a stopword list. So we're going to restart the session. Okay, so now when it restarts the session, it remembers the settings that I had before. So if you make a mistake and you forget to apply your stopword list, you don't have to go back and tell it to look only at selected documents for LiveDocs or whatever. It remembers those settings before, as well as any other settings that you may have configured here with regard to the word length or frequency. And it also remembers your stopword list if, in fact, you selected a stopword list. But if you want to change to a different stopword list, you can do that. In this particular case, I'm going to create a new one. So I click Save As, and I will call this the EUR-LEX. I can't type today. Okay, it'll be my EUR-LEX English list. And, oh, actually, though, I want to use Kilgray's list as the starting point. Okay, there. Now we have a copy of Kilgray's Old English list, which will be the starting point for our EUR-LEX English list. And now, when the list comes up, we're not going to see things like "and" in it because these will all have been excluded. Okay, we've still got different expressions there. Now, one thing I want to point out, as you go through in your term work and you accept certain candidates and offer translations for them, for example, these are immediately available in translation. This is one way in which the memoQ, memoQ term extraction differs from what you see in other environments. Here, for example, we can see, the term harmonization, Angleichung in German, is here as the third translation result in the list. And you see a little shovel icon there. That shovel icon indicates that it comes from the term extraction session. And in fact, this comes from the demo 2 extraction session that I was doing on an earlier occasion. So if you have 2 or 3 or 4 different extraction sessions, as you accept and translate any of the terms that come up in these sessions, these will be available in your translation work right away. You don't even have to send them to a term base. It's useful to send them to a term base because then you can adjust the properties more, but you do have immediate use of these things, which is a very helpful thing, especially when you're working under some time pressure. And again, here we can sort by frequency. Okay, so I've got the most frequent terms up at the top here. Excuse me, the least frequent terms at the moment. Okay, now I've got the most frequent terms, equipment, and so forth. And because of the settings that I had, the term extraction session has looked at the term bases that are attached to my project and pre-translated some of these terms, working off of the available entries in the term base. Let's have a look at some of the elements on the window just to orient ourselves. Okay, in the middle, we've got our terms list, obviously. In the lower left-hand side, we've got the occurrences of all of the terms in various term bases that may be available in different translation memories and so forth. And here you see a lot of the context where those terms might be showing up. And for example, here with the highlighted occurrence that I have, if I look directly underneath it, it says source. Okay, this is coming from the alignment of the EU voltage, low voltage directive, for example. And if I wanted to choose, for example, here, I said, oh, this is a good context example that I would like to have as part of my term entry. I can use one of the commands here in this gray bar, for example, add target as example. Click there. And it takes that entire target entry, or I can also use the source as an example. And unfortunately, you can't take a selection in the occurrences window, like, this, for example, and then add that specifically. It'll take the whole entry, but once it's up here, you can edit the entry to have just the text that you want in that particular place. Okay, and if you decide that, okay, this is, this context example isn't necessarily what I want here. But okay, if you decide that, okay, this is a term that you want to use here, then you can use Control Enter or whatever you've configured for accept, or you can use the accept as term command in the ribbon here. I have it configured as Control Down, which I don't think is the standard keyboard shortcut. I have my own keyboard shortcuts. And you'll notice that in the status column, it's now been changed from candidate to accepted and marked green. And so, for example, here I can do the same for conformity. Okay, and if I see other words that are not interesting, for example, this one or this one, I can drop those terms. Okay, and so now we see the three possible statuses: accepted terms, dropped terms, and then those we haven't worked on yet are referred to as candidates. And when we resort the list, either using the resort now command, which shows up just under project home, or by clicking on one of the column headers to do the sorting, these accepted terms will all go up to the top of the list, and all of the terms that we've dropped will go down to the bottom. Okay, and so we can go through and say, all right, electrical equipment, that might be a pretty good thing by itself. I can use copy keyboard shortcuts, click over my target, okay, adjust the grammar a wee bit, okay, and then I'm going to accept that term. Okay, and as I work through, I can at any point I want to export the results of my term work. I can export, for example, to Excel. That's a convenient format if I'm sharing with colleagues who work with other tools like WordFast or SDL Trados. Everybody can deal with terms in Excel. As clients in particular probably would prefer Excel in many cases. So I simply click on that, and I can save the list there. That's it. Now I've got an Excel list that has my stuff. Or I can export to a particular term base. Okay, and it will be, here I have a list of all of the term bases that are attached to my project. So if I have a document that has vocabulary that might belong in several different term bases, it might have some legal vocabulary, it might have some medical vocabulary, it might have some technical engineering vocabulary, I can go through the list and maybe on the first pass, only accept the terms that are for legal terminology, and then I would export them to my legal term base. And then maybe after that, I'll drop the terms. Okay, so they will be excluded from the selection. And then I'll go through and I'll select all of the engineering or all of the financial vocabulary, and then send that to the specific term base for that purpose. Just because I like to keep my term bases well sorted out with each other. You also have the opportunity, each time you export terminology, to add metadata indicating the subject area, for example, or the client or whatever. So you can also differentiate the vocabulary in your term bases this way. So even if you're always exporting to one particular term base, in your first export, you could mark the subject area as medical or legal or something like that. And again, differentiate the terminology that you're collecting each time you write to the term base. There's also the possibility, which is very useful, to add dropped candidates to the stopword list. Now, if you're using this strategy of dropping all the things from different subject areas each time, you might want to be a little careful about that. But if you're going through and saying, oh, gee, this word, that's common vocabulary, good riddance. I don't need to see national and made. Okay, that's a very common word. That's a word I don't really want to see anymore. These are all words that did not make it into the standard list from Kilgray. Other. Okay, I don't think anybody needs to collect other as vocabulary, so I'm going to drop that. I'm going to drop all. And now, if I choose to add all of my dropped terms to the stopword list, the next time I do a term extraction, I will not see that terminology. And so my extraction session becomes more focused, and I get better results faster. So there are a lot of different options here that you can use to improve your term extraction work. Okay, so I think here, let's see, what other things may be of interest. One of the things I often do is I will sort in alphabetical order, and then I'll start to look through and see, oh, okay, this is basically the same term, national measure, national measures. Sometimes, if I'm interested in the statistical frequency of particular terms, I might want to merge these into a single entry, just so I can keep track of how often that term is really being used. And there's a feature for this called merge candidates. Okay, so now it's one entry with the combined frequency of both of them. This isn't something you need to do every time you do term extraction, but in some cases it is particularly helpful, especially if you're having a discussion with the client about the frequency of particular terms. This feature for prefix, merge, and hide, this is for languages I don't work with, where prefixes are particularly important. If you work with a language where term extraction is typically difficult because of that particular property of the language, I recommend you have a look at the memoQ help. The memoQ term extraction module is set up to help you collect terminology where that might be difficult or nearly impossible with a lot of other term extraction tools that lack this particular feature. And that's really the most important features. There are, of course, other commands here, but which ones are relevant to you are really a matter of personal need. Down in the lower right-hand side, if you've got term hits, you can basically toggle through any of these and see what your attached term bases have to say about a particular term, and it shows you what term base it comes from and so forth, which may also be relevant to you. Anyway, so that's really all there is to term extraction work. And just a couple more points that I want to make. I've got a few prepared slides for that, and then we'll open it up to questions if there are any. Okay, one of the things you can see here on the slide. Okay, this is just a view of some exported terminology that I sent out from a memoQ term base, or it can also be sent from a term extraction session. On the right-hand side, you see what the term-based export dialog looks like if you're choosing to export your terminology as Excel. One interesting thing that was included in memoQ version 8.4 that I find very helpful for working with clients and colleagues is the ability to have special marking for forbidden terminology. For example, here you see two terms that were marked as forbidden. One of them is, I want to use the term metal tin as opposed to metal can. And I prefer to use individual agreement instead of individual contract on one of the client projects that I was working on. And when I exported the terminology from the term base, in this case, those forbidden terms, the ones that were marked with the forbidden property in the memoQ term base, were marked in red. And this works in all versions of memoQ 8.4 and later. And what was also nice in memoQ 8.4 is if you had an Excel list of terms to import into memoQ, terms that were marked red in Excel would be imported as forbidden terms in memoQ. So, for example, the quality assurance module would warn you, or you would see it in the translation results list marked in black, so you can avoid using that particular term. Unfortunately, in the current version of memoQ, there's a small bug that was introduced for the import side. So right now, until they release the fix, which I'm told will be coming in one of the bug fix builds in memoQ 8.7, red marked Excel terminology that you import into memoQ will not be marked forbidden as it should be. So be careful if you're working in that situation. But the export works just fine. And soon everything will be back working the way it should be, I hope. And we can go both ways. So this is a useful thing to do in your translation processes with clients and colleagues. And that concludes what I got to show you with term extraction. Again, this is just one of those tools where you can maintain control of the processes, do better work, and show off your professional knowledge and skills more effectively.